Hello and welcome once again to the Justice Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again, as always, on the program today. And I just want to give you a quick reminder that Justice Center as an organization is supported by donors, so I would ask that you would consider becoming a contributor if you have benefited from the things that we do here through our podcast and the YouTube channel and the publishing house. You can go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page, and you can also sign up for our newsletter. That's a big help. We're trying to grow our email list. You can go to justincenter.org right on the front page there. You can sign up, and that way you can get updates on all the things that we're doing, courses and seminars at the Widener Institute, new publications, and other initiatives that we have as an organization. All right, so I'm going to be discussing today Friedrich Julius Stahl, and I've spoken about him before, so this is the third in a series on Stahl. The first one was an overview of Joseph Stahl's life, kind of who he was and what his context was. And then the second was an overview of some of his ideas. So Friedrich Julius Stahl, just quick overview. If you haven't watched those other two, you don't know who he is. He is a 19th century Lutheran political theorist. And not only is he a political theorist, but he is very theologically engaged. He is one who very strongly supported the confessional Lutheranism in Germany in the 19th century, fighting against what was the Prussian Union, which was a kind of forced union between Lutheran and Reformed churches. He was very distinctively Lutheran, and he has sometimes been referred to as the German Edmund Burke. And so he, like Edmund Burke, the British statesman, is under the broader umbrella of more conservative political philosophy, but it's distinctively Lutheran in his orientation. So a lot of the kind of categories that he grabs onto and uses to expound upon his ideas of the state and the role of law and the role of the state really do stem from not just Martin Luther, but the Lutheran tradition as a whole and how Lutherans conceive of the state. But this has plenty of relevance to the broader Christian tradition or even the broader Western tradition, even for those who are not in any way Lutheran. So we talked about a number of issues leading up to this point, so it's probably helpful to go back to those. But if you really just want to listen to this talk on rights and you haven't watched the prior one, you can probably still follow along here. So we're looking at Stahl's perspective on the question of rights. And rights arise within political philosophy really in the modern era. And so if you look at like classical philosophical writings, whether you're looking at, say, ancient Rome, for example, or the medieval Western Christian traditions, the language of rights is generally applied to properties rather than persons. And so today, like especially in, say, an American context for my American listeners, which many of you are, but not all of you are, we have a Bill of Rights, and we use language of rights constantly to talk about what is the foundation of the state. What is the purpose of government is essentially to protect the rights of individual people. That's at least an essential role of government, if not the primary role of government in a lot of modern liberal conceptions. And this notion of rights as being so central, especially to persons, is new with the Enlightenment. So in the pre-Enlightenment world, there certainly were concepts of liberty under law, so it's not like that's totally absent. And the language of rights generally tended to be used with relation to things, as I said. So you have a right to something. You have a right to your own home, say. You have a right to your own property or to your own spouse, those kinds of things. And maybe spouse would be a person, but we're really talking about mostly people in relation to things. And you do find that between spouses to some extent. So maybe that's the one kind of exception to that. But generally, when we look at rights, this is not really the grounding of government. It's not really the foundation of government, though in terms of property, we talk about property rights as being most fundamental there. Okay, so then we have in the post-Reformation era, the rise of this kind of talk of right as being really foundational for government itself. I have a talk I'm going to be recording at some point soon, hopefully, on Thomas Hobbes and his conception of rights in his book Leviathan. This isn't new with him. He grabs onto the writings of Grotius, who many of my listeners may know if you're familiar with theological history of that era. as a major Arminian theological figure, but he was largely a political theorist as well. And so he grounds the function or purpose of the state in right, and right specifically has reference to someone's right to life. And so there is a right that someone has to protect their own life and well-being. And Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan then takes that idea of right and makes that really foundational for the construction of the state as a whole. And then we get to people like John Locke and the rise of the broader ideology that we refer to as liberalism. So by liberalism, I'm not referring to conservative versus liberal. I'm talking about kind of the whole ideological apparatus between left and right that we find within much of the modern Western world. So with all of that brief background here, I want to look at what Stahl says about right. And I think someone in one of my comments referred to Stahl as the most conservative liberal, and I think that's a pretty accurate portrayal of Stahl, is that he doesn't totally deny some of the basic premises of a liberal government or a liberal state. However, he does it in such a way that there isn't this emphasis solely on individual freedoms in an isolated way. Not that he's not concerned with liberty. And that's true of a lot of the classical conservatives too. So even someone like, Edmund Burke, who is often referred to as a liberal, though that has been contested by some who don't refer to him as a liberal at all. It kind of depends how broadly you're using that term. All right, so let's go on here to say, what is it that he says about rights? Okay, so there's a picture of Stahl here. If you're watching the video, of course, we have the audio podcast on. You obviously can't see anything. I do have a slideshow here. Okay, first point here. Humans as ethical beings are bound to one another. And so the foundation of rights for Stahl is going to be very different for what you find in a lot of liberal philosophies that are more individually focused. So the notion of rights really comes from this starting point for Stahl that there is a boundness of one person to another person. We have these social bonds and ties that are essential to who we are as human persons and essential to what society is. And so there is a difference between this more conservative conception, we're talking about classical conservatism here, and that which you find in someone like Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes tends to see society as really starting with and primarily being the individual in his own freedom and isolation. And human bonds then flow out of that individuality of the person in that what he calls a state of nature. For Stahl, exactly the opposite is the case, that we are first and foremost bound to other persons in this fundamental state. And he doesn't talk about really a state of nature, but as God created us, we are, and this is fundamentally tied up with this notion that we are ethical beings. And to be an ethical being is to be one who has duties to other people. To be an ethical being is not to be an isolated individual who has to make ethical decisions solely for the purpose of making room for freedom for another person to express themselves. That's often how we think about ethics in a more liberal context, especially today. This idea that consensuality is the primary ethical category of not just political life, but ethical life in general. And so as long as you are whatever you're doing is okay as long as there is some kind of consensuality. That roots ethics primarily in individuality, because what it says is ethics are really this thing that we kind of create perhaps as a social construct in order to make the social contract work, to leave these individuals to express themselves as much as possible without infringing on someone else's self-expression. But for Stahl, we are ethical beings as such, as God has made us, and that means that we are bound to one another. Therefore, we have duties to one another. If we are ethical by nature, and if that ethical nature is bound up in social relations, that means that our ethical nature gives us duties. So there are duties that we have between people. And so I have certain duties to obey, say, my parents. And my children have a duty to obey me. We have duties in various ways toward other people. And what Stahl is going to say is that these duties are grounded in rights. Not that rights come from duties, but the other way around. In other words, why do I have a duty to my wife to be faithful? Well, because she has a right to have a faithful husband. So there is this intimate connection between duties and rights, where the right is first and the duty flows out of those various rights. And so Stahl refers here to rights as law in a subjective sense. And so this is law as it applies to other people. And so my ethical duties in terms of a moral duty flow out of the rights that the other person has. Say, I'm talking about this in terms of family, but we can speak about this in other contexts as well. It's not only within familial contexts, but we are largely talking about vocation, as he's going to talk about later. And what I mean by vocation is this is an idea that shows up in Martin Luther's theology, which is why, again, Stahl is very distinctively Lutheran in the categories that he uses. It's great. If you want to read a book on this, Gustav Wingren has this book called Lutheran Vocation. It's extremely helpful. And Luther essentially says that each human person has a variety of vocations. And by vocation, he does not mean your job. That is a vocation, but vocation is broader than that. So vocatio, this is call. So callings. God has placed us in these different social spheres and circles, and within each of those, he has given us callings. So you have a unique calling as a daughter, or as a mother, or as a child, or as a student, or as a co-worker of somebody, or a boss, or a citizen of your county or country. These are all various callings or vocations. And our rights and our duties are connected to those particular callings that we have. In other words, rights are not to be abstracted from our actual communities and actual social relationships. This is distinct from the way that rights are often spoken of today, that says that, as a human being, you have these inherent rights that are just yours de facto. That regardless, it has nothing to do with your social situation or your station or who your family is or whether you even have a family or your job or any of that. It is that you as an individual person have just de facto rights. And in some ways, human beings can even be said, I think in a lot of modern thought, to be really bundles of various rights, almost that make up our nature. That who are you as a human being? I am a self-expressive thing that has various rights. And therefore, if I have these various rights that are, again, totally abstracted, I can then claim that you have to treat me in a certain way because I demand such because of who I am. This is a lot of our ethical and political discourse today comes back to this fundamental conviction. So we really have to, I think, challenge that and ask, what do you mean? What are these rights? Where do they come from? And then how do you even determine what they are? We have this problem that rights are more asserted than they are actually argued for. And yes, some of this does come down to the language of rights as self-evident. And I recognize that's in the U.S. Bill of Rights. There's a valid way to speak about that, but when all we're doing is just claiming that I am made up of rights that you have to honor, and I get to just kind of declare whatever I want those to be and just say, and I don't have to argue for them and just say, well, it's just self-evident I have these rights. Well, okay, you can't have a functioning discussion where that's the assumption, because you're basically saying, I'm saying it's so, and you can't argue with me because it's self-evident. Well, it's not a groundwork for any positive discourse at all. All right. So I do think that we can certainly speak about rights of individuals in a fundamental sense, that is that basic right to life. Okay, and that's what we see in someone like Hobbes, but even the way that Hobbes goes about it, I think, is wrong. But I don't think it's wrong to start with this fundamental right to say, yes, of course, as beings that God has created, we do have a granted right to protect ourselves and to protect our family and to protect our properties. And we'll see some of this expanded throughout this here. All right. Next point that Stahl makes here is that rights are not granted to institutions, but persons. So rights are something that do stem from a unique value and dignity of human beings as free creatures. Rights for Stahl are dependent upon a higher order. They are dependent upon God. So rights in some sense aren't really inherent. They are something that is actually given. It's given by God. They're divinely given. So it's not just kind of abstractified and inherent because I am a human person, therefore I have rights. You have to have some kind of metaphysical grounding for that. How can I have rights? Who has given them to me? Am I just asserting them? This is to say that we need to have, if we're speaking about rights, a divine source, a divine authority that has been granted to us. And so as Stahl talks about in all of his writings, the human orders that we have within human societies and governments are dependent upon and built upon that higher order, which is a divine order. So God stands behind what is granted in this physical temporal world. And so God has granted rights, and he has granted rights uniquely to personalities. And so it's the personality of humans that is essential for the conception of rights that applies to them uniquely and not to institutions. Stahl says very explicitly that rights are not the primary principle of the legal order. And that is going to be a really essential differentiation between Stahl and then many of the liberals, like you find with a Thomas Paine. I'm going to be doing something on Thomas Paine as well in the future. But when you have certain figures who speak about, especially the way they talk about the social contract, the state and the reason the state exists at all, it can often be said that the state exists for the purpose of protecting individual rights. And so Stahl is saying that's not the purpose of the state, but that doesn't mean that the state doesn't protect rights, but that is secondary to the primary principle. And so Stahl refers to that primary principle of the legal order as the telos of life relations, meaning really a common good. That's what he's talking about here, to say that the primary principle of the legal order is a common good. It is the goodness or goal of life relations within a given society. And so there is this common good, and serving that common good is the purpose of the state, to point people toward that common good, to work toward that common good. But underneath that then, and within that common good, there are certain rights that are given to individuals that must be protected. And what this does is that this political philosophy then protects us both from that kind of individualistic libertinism where the states can say nothing about, say, morality at all, or goodness, or point toward any kind of moral order, on the one hand, and it guards against a kind of authoritarianism which would say that we determine what the common good is, and thereby we have removed all rights from citizens in order to enforce this kind of broader communal, what we have determined to be good, that you find in like communist nations. And so I think this differentiation of the essential nature of both of these and the rights flowing out of, well, not even really flowing out of the latter in the fullest sense, rights come directly from God, helps to balance these dangerous tendencies. And these dangerous tendencies of a kind of communitarianism where the individual life is not valued at all. It was often the case in pre-Christian societies, and it's still the case in many countries and cultures today, especially ones that have not been Christianized. And then this kind of absolute libertarianism, where there is no real moral order in the state at all. Okay, rights and duties. So these things come together. As I said before, rights don't arise from duties. Instead, duties come from rights. Stahl says that rights are divinely granted. They are given by God. They're not created by human order, though the way that they function is, to some extent, a creation of human order. And they are ends in themselves. Sounds kind of Kantian here in the way that he's talking. So rights are ends in themselves. In other words, if my, say, wife has a right to my affection and loyalty as her husband, that right doesn't serve just some higher purpose or order. It doesn't serve, and yes, a divine order, but it's not purely utilitarian, in other words. She doesn't have a right to that so that she can do X, Y, and Z. It's its own end. Because we're talking about that which God has created for a particular order. So if things follow the divine order that God has created, that in and of itself is a good. Rights and duties stand together in coherence. Coherence is the term, or at least that's a translation of a term that Stahl uses here. And so we can't talk about rights without also talking about duties. People love today to talk about rights, but don't really like talking about duties. And they always go hand in hand. And the next point here is one that I had already mentioned, that it's really in vocation that rights and duties are unified in one singular order. And so in some ways, vocation is really the best category or the broadest category in which we can and should discuss the social order. The social order is made up of a number of various vocations or callings that determine both the rights of an individual and the duties of an individual in the context of social relations. Stahl is going to say that all duties correspond to a right. So every duty that you have corresponds to some fundamental right someone else has to my loyalty or my actions in one way or another. But that's not always true the other way around. Because rights are more fundamental, that it's not of necessity that rights correspond to duties. However, reading Stahl, they pretty much always do. So, okay. And here's just an example of how duties and rights flow together. So you have a duty not to harm your neighbor. You have a duty not to, walk across the street, talk about a literal neighbor, walk across the street and punch your neighbor in the face. You have a duty not to do that. It's a moral duty. And why is that? Because your neighbor has a right to not be harmed, to not be punched in the face. So duties and rights go together. And the nature of these duties, Stahl is going to say, the way that they work themselves out, flow out of the particular shape of that given legal order. And that means that duties in one society are not always going to correspond to duties in another society. That does not mean that this is some kind of moral relativism. That's not what Stahl is arguing for here. It's not moral relativism to say that your duties to, say duties to the state, because this is a very obvious example that states function in different ways. And Stahl is not going to say that there is one type of divinely ordered state that needs to function worldwide. And we could talk about this with how some conceptions of liberalism function, which says that essentially the liberal democracy, the liberal democratic order is the absolute state of government in some, maybe not perfection, but is the end of political developments. Like this is the primary form of government, and if societies across the world are going to function well, they also must function within liberal democracies. This leads to nation building, like happened in the Middle East under the Bush administration. And I don't generally talk about foreign policy or particular politicians and stuff. That's not really my role, but that is an example of this mentality that Stahl is not arguing for, that there is some kind of absolute perfection in one particular form of government. Right? Scripture does not command us to build one form of government. So that means that in some societies, some forms of government, there will be duties that you don't have in another one. So if you live in a state like the United States, citizens have a significant amount of power, right? We can vote, though I still wouldn't say we really have a duty to vote, but there are certain rights that we have, or obligations that we have, or abilities that we have that would be distinct from living in an absolute monarchy. Okay, so the duty of a citizen in, say, pre-revolutionary France is very different from the duty of a citizen in the modern United States. And so even though the moral law in a transcendent sense has not changed, the forms of that, what Stahl calls positive law, the way that these things function in any given society, does change because it is dependent upon history and human structure and the uniqueness of any given civilization. And so duties flow out of that unique shape of each social order. Okay. Sorry, I don't know why my video is like doing that. Okay. Rights and the divine order. Rights are not about mere personal, consensual choice, but instead about God's world order. And Stahl argues very blatantly against our current conception that tends to form our politics in the Western world, that does seem to equate rights with consensual choice, that our rights really are, in some sense, defined as anything that I want to do that doesn't explicitly harm another person or does not explicitly violate another person's freedom for them to do whatever they want to do. And for Stahl, you don't have rights that do not flow out of God's world order, his eternal order. And so we don't get to just kind of create rights. And so that world order stands behind or underneath or as the foundation of rights as they are expressed by us. Here's the example that Stahl uses constantly in his writing, and that is no-fault divorce. So from that kind of consensual approach to rights that we have moved increasingly toward in the United States, you have a right to dissolve a marriage if you want to, especially if the other person also wants to dissolve that marriage, because it's a contract. Everything is a contract. So government is a contract, all social bonds are contracts, and contracts can just be easily broken as long as everybody agrees on it. Which means that kind of all your social bonds are really fleeting. They don't bind you to anything because you can just get rid of them or discard them when you feel like it. And so if marriage is defined as this kind of free contract that is concerned with the preservation of the rights of both individuals such that they can remain in that contract as long as they want to, and then if they don't want to anymore, they can just freely end it, well, then of course you have a right to divorce. You have a right to self-autonomy. And if you want to just get out of something you deem to be bad for you or oppressive or whatever it might be, you can just get out of it. And Stahl would say, and does say, that it is a violation of one's right to get divorced in a no-fault divorce. And he speaks about you're violating the other person's right because if I get married and I make vows, my wife has a right to my faithfulness. So I don't get to just step out of that. Further, he says it's a violation of your own right. And so further, just as my wife has a right to my faithfulness, I have a right to her faithfulness. And so if I choose to, if we choose to, not that we ever would, but but if someone were to choose to, just get rid of that bond, right, and cut off that bond, they are therefore violating the right of each person, because your right is not just about what you want in that moment. So even if I say, I don't want my wife's faithfulness, too bad. it's still your right because marriage is more than just this free, random contract. And Stahl sees the acceptance of a no-fault divorce, which he foresees happening in the future. He sees that as essentially the breakdown of the entire social order. And for Stahl, that's kind of the sign that we've broken all contractual obligations to one another because this kind of fundamental unit within the marriage has been broken, the primary of all social bonds. And if we've made that a mere contract that you can just get out of, you've really destroyed the fundamental, basic communal element of society as a whole. And so everything else is going to collapse after that. Stahl cites at one point a right to receive proper punishment when violating the moral order. And he uses the death penalty for murder as an example of this. So capital punishment, Stahl's extremely explicit about capital punishment being a right. Like if you commit that act, you have a right to be punished via capital punishment. It's pretty bold, especially in light of the Pope Francis Roman views today. Not that we would be bound by that. And so that just shows up very clearly the conception of right that Stahl is working with here is fundamentally different from what we're working with largely today. Stahl differentiates between two different kinds of duties. There are these legal duties, and the legal duties are things like, you have a duty not to steal someone else's property. Okay, that would be a legal duty. So that's it's not really much of a positive, ethical decision to not go take a baseball bat to my neighbor's car and smash it for no reason. It's not really technically, okay, I guess it's an ethical decision not to do that, but nobody's going to praise you ethically for doing that. You're not going out of your way to do anything, just not being wicked. But there is then these duties of love. And the duties of love are the things that we are called to do to actually serve and do something positive. And these are not things that are determined by the legal order, but these are things that as ethical beings we are called to do. Here he's really, really sticking with Luther's small catechism and the way that Luther expresses things in the catechism, which is that Luther takes these 10 commandments as these kind of thou shalt nots, these, in other words, boundaries around what you shouldn't do. And Luther, in giving his explanations of those, moves away from just the thou shalt not to the positive commands of God that flow out of that. So what does it mean that I should not lie? Well, for Luther, yes, of course it means that I shouldn't lie, but it also means that there's a positive command, which is I should speak well of my neighbor. I should actually positively strive to be honest with my words and my actions. Those are these duties of love that Stahl is speaking about here. And so we should view our relations to others not just in terms of legal duties, certainly on a personal or social level, I'm not talking about the legal order here, but we should look at them with questions of the duties of love. So the example that I give here is to actively protect someone's life rather than simply leaving them alone. So say if my neighbor, instead of just not smashing my neighbor's car with a baseball bat, maybe it means, my neighbor's car is broken down, and so perhaps I offer to let them borrow my car for a little while theirs is in the shop, or offer to do something to help them, or call AAA for them, or whatever it might be. All right. There's then a distinction between innate rights and acquired rights. And this is a bit of a Kantian distinction that he's making to some extent here. So innate rights, in that we have the kind of general and universal versus the particular and circumstantial, which Kant uses a lot in his ethics. So there definitely is some Kantian influence in Stahl here. And I'm critical of Kant in many ways, but I think these distinctions are helpful here. So these innate rights are those that are general and universal. And so these are those things that we generally refer to as these inherent rights. Now, the language of it being inherent that's not language that Stahl is going to use, because these are divinely given rights. They come from the divine order. You just don't have them as a human essence for no reason. They're granted, divinely granted to personalities uniquely. So these innate rights are those that are general and universal. So they are the rights that everybody has. So if one person has a right to something and another doesn't, that's not one of these innate rights. So these innate rights are universal for all human people all across the world, all social strata, all races. There's no, men and women. These extend beyond all of those categories. Whoever shares a human essence has these rights. And so he then outlines what these are. The first of these is life. Okay, so there is this universal right to life, and here he is following the liberal tradition. The second is liberty. Now, that has to be understood rightly, because very clearly what Stahl means by liberty is not you have the ability to do whatever you want, but there is this general freedom that people have. We can't be completely constrained. There is a recognition that the state should have, that we are individual personalities that have a relative freedom in our actions. The third is honor. Now, that's interesting that he speaks about honor as this universal right, because honor is basically non-existent in our culture. We don't have any conception of honor, but for Stahl, that's fundamental, that we have honor toward other people. And that's universal. There is a right, everyone has a right to honor. Now, the way that honor is going to be exercised or should be exercised toward you, the showing of honor is going to be vocation dependent. But all people do have a right to be honored. The capacity for property. And so Stahl is going to say that this certainly speaks to the issue of slavery. If you say that you are property and can't own no property, well, that's a violation of this universal right. So there is this universal right for a capacity for property. Now, why he says capacity for property is because what he's not saying is that there is a universal right for you to have X, Y, and Z. There is a right to, and this is a lot of language today, we're talking very specifically. Everyone has a right to education. Everyone has a right to a college education. Everybody has a right to a certain amount of money or something like that. That's not what he's talking about, but it is that you have a capacity to own things in your social order, which means, again, against slavery. There has to be some kind of freedom to acquire things for yourself, and this, I think, speaks to the Marxist issue as well, where Marx at times does say that the goal is the elimination of private property. Now, I know that there are a lot of Marxist writings that try to dispute that Marx really meant that in the fullest sense. I don't know, but he at least said it, okay? Family. So there is an innate right to having a family, to get married. Now, to get married, Stahl is speaking here about getting married in accord with the divine order. So what he's not talking about is a random social contract between any group of people that decide to call something a marriage in any circumstance. But he is talking about marriage of a man and a woman. Again, this is opposed to, say, what happened in much of the American slave trade. There were families that were ripped apart. People were not allowed to get married. That's a violation of rights. Then we have political and ecclesiastical rights. It's interesting that he sees these as innate. He doesn't expand upon this really at all. But what I gather from what he says is that what he's talking about is really this kind of capacity for rights. In other words, that you have this capacity that you are going to have some rights in the church and some rights within the political order. So you, as existing in both the political and ecclesiastical order, have rights to exist in those in some way. Okay, then we have the acquired rights, which we're moving into the particularities here of what's applied where. These are particular, they are specific. These are those rights which correspond to the particular shape of institutions in a given society. So this is what I mentioned earlier with different governmental structures. So your rights in a monarchy are very different from your rights in a democracy or something like that. And I know people all argue that, no, we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic. You can find lots of American political theorists, 18th, 19th century, that are totally fine using the term democracy to refer to our society. I found it pretty common. And they don't mean an absolute democracy. They're using it in a more general sense. So just because I know people are going to critique me on that, because they always do. Okay. All right. Here's just an example of how that may differ. I'm looking at church structures. Okay. So there are different polities that various churches have. And at least within the Lutheran tradition, we don't have an absolute idea of what the perfect ecclesiastical structure is. And so our congregations they don't all follow exactly the same pattern in the way that Presbyterians do, all follow a Presbyterian structure, or say Roman Catholics follow a particular structure. We have a variety of structures. Now you could argue whether that's good or not, but whatever the structure is, if you have different structures, that means that the rights that someone has in a congregation that has various structures are going to be a little bit different. So if you are in a more congregational church, so if you're in a church that ultimately the final decisions for that congregation are going to be made by congregational vote, well, you have a right to vote then, if you're a congregant and not ordained. If you are in, say, a Presbyterian church where the decisions are made by the session, the presbytery, well, if you are not part of the presbytery, you don't have those same rights. But doesn't mean you have no rights in the congregation, but they're going to be different rights. So those things are particular, they're changing, and that if they're changing or acquired, that means that they're not things that we have to hold on to absolutely. All right. Now, this is the talking about here is the rights of classical liberalism. By classical liberalism here, I'm talking about really someone like a Thomas Jefferson or a Thomas Paine, or the ideology behind the French Revolution. And Stahl is very critical of that ideology. So the French Revolution determined rights as definitive and valid a priori. And a priori means not derived from experience or from particulars. So in other words, the French Revolution is not talking about these acquired rights that Stahl is talking about. Everything is an innate right. And so all rights are basically determined by this kind of ideal experiment of creating this conception of the state of nature that you find with Thomas Hobbes and the liberals generally. And this conception of the state of nature essentially says that we need to imagine humanity in this pre-civilized state, prior to the construction of government or civic society. And within that kind of broad general state, we need to consider, well, how would humans relate to one another? What are people's rights? And then from there, we move to constructing some kind of notion of what the role of government is, or structure of government, from that theoretical state of nature. So we are really dealing with kind of thought experiments instead of looking at things as they are. A posteriori, you're looking at things as acquired through experience, looking at the society that we're given right now and say, okay, well, in light of how our society functions, how can we best improve living conditions for the poor or whatever? That's kind of a posteriori reasoning. Instead, in this view, what you're doing is using this kind of abstraction to say, okay, in my little thought experiment, what rights does everyone just have? And all rights for the French Revolution are really those inherent and universal rights. Now, this then is set in opposition for those in the French Revolution, to positive law. Now, positive law, as we've discussed, is law as it is given in a particular society. So how it is that any individual society legislates, the law that that particular government has. And so for the French Revolution, these are set opposed to one another. So we have these kind of inherent rights that are universal, and then this positive law, or the law of society, is often in conflict with these inherent rights. And that means that the positive law really isn't a judge of much of anything at all. Instead, we determine all of our decisions or ethical decision-making, at least in a legal sense, from an inherent law rather than a legislated law. And what that means is that we have the freedom to overthrow any inherited law that we see as violating those internal inherent rights. And so there's this constant conflict, or looking at any moral system that is legislated with some kind of absolute skepticism as it's going to violate my rights. And man, that just makes a society like incapable of functioning. You see what happened with the French Revolution. You can't do that, because anybody can just determine what their rights are, and you can just determine, well, now they're violating my rights, so I don't have to obey anymore. And then you have no social order, and you can't have an order with that idea in mind. Okay. For Stahl, these rights only take shape. So while they're grounded in something universal, those universal rights, they only take shape within the existing political order. So we're not just talking about abstractions, these abstractified ahistorical ideals. We're talking about what is the shape of the political order, what are my callings, and what is my vocation. And that's how I talk about rights. What does that mean for me in my particular society, in the particular government that I have, or my own citizenship, or my community, or my family? How do rights apply in those particular contexts? So we're talking on the ground reality here, not just these thought experiments to create some perfect or utopian form of government to just be imposed from on high on a people. The true primeval right, Stahl says, is not freedom from compulsion. He's seeing these ideas that we see today, that liberty is defined as freedom from compulsion. Instead, he says the true right is the achievement of spiritual perfection. So what he's saying here is that the real right of man is to achieve, well, that pursuit of happiness. You know, that the founding fathers of the United States that use that language. But life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what does that mean? Happiness, if we're going to talk about it in a modern sense, it's like, I can do whatever makes me feel good. But happiness in a classical sense, we're talking about eudaimonism. This is the ethical idea that you find governing Plato or Aristotle's philosophy that's then taken over by the Christian tradition. And that is, a happy life is one that is a well-ordered life, a good life, a life that is aimed at the right things, one that has a telos. There is an end for man. There is something that we are created to try to achieve or strive for or reach out for. And for Stahl, he says that's really the basis of society, is this right to pursue that, to pursue goodness, to pursue spiritual perfection, as he calls it. Now, that means that what grounds society is not something that we already have, but a striving of people towards spiritual perfection. So it's not that our value and dignity is just something that is inherent as we are, right? You're good as you are, but instead it's something that we seek for. We live a life here in order to achieve, to pursue a life of virtue and goodness. And this, as a good Lutheran, Stahl is going to recognize you're never going to achieve that. You're going to be a saint and a sinner. We're always going to fall short of that. But this gives you the directionality of your life, is that striving towards that. And society as a whole should do that. Doesn't mean society is always going to do that, but we should do that. And that's how we should look at our rights, not first as my individuality, but instead as the freedom I have to seek virtue and live the good life that God has called me to. Okay. Inalienable rights. Now, the language of inalienable rights does show up in Stahl. Okay, so what is inalienable? He speaks about both innate and acquired rights as being inalienable. And so he mentions here life, freedom, and this is what I mentioned earlier too, the possibility of, or the freedom to be able to get married or have children. He mentions fatherhood specifically, but motherhood would be the same here. And so these are things that the government cannot take away. In other words, the government cannot take away, cannot override your ability to get married, because that is more fundamental and foundational than government is as a whole anyway. Government can ratify something that is transcendent and divine, but it cannot create that. It can reflect that eternal order, and marriage is part of that eternal order, and it can ratify that, but it can't create the eternal order. Okay. And I already mentioned this earlier. This doesn't mean that you can demand children. Okay, you see this now, that I have a right to children, therefore I can use whatever reproductive technologies I want to make a child. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about demanding what you want, but you have a freedom to get married and try to have children in the way that has been created through natural law. These rights, he uses the language of active potency, which is something that this is a Thomistic language here that he's using. This comes from Thomas Aquinas. Active potency means that there is a potentiality for these things that exists within each person inherently. So you have a potentiality to get married, to be a mother or father, and that potentiality can then be actualized through an actual marriage or the creation of a child. Final point here on these inalienable rights is that for Stahl, government does not rest upon a social contract in which some primeval rights are given up. This is the notion that we see in a lot of social contract theory, which says that we essentially have all of these rights and we give up some rights in order to have a functioning society. So I give up my right to hurt my neighbor in order to protect, to create a society where neighbors aren't all hurting each other, okay? So I've given up some right of myself. For Stahl, this is not the case. This is not the case. It doesn't rest upon this at all. Okay, the origin of rights. Where do these rights come from? Rights, for Stahl, are discussed under two different principles of the legal order. The first of these is life relations. That's the first one. So how do we relate to other people? And so the rights don't begin just with the isolated self, but they begin with social relations, one person to another. But second, they do relate to human freedom. But that's not the primary or only function of rights. That comes secondarily, though essentially and importantly. Rights come in two ways. Now, we're talking here about the acquired rights. We're talking about rights as they function in a particular realm of society. So they come in two ways. One is through will and act. And so the signing of a contract, if you sign a contract, now you have a right to certain things that you did not have a right to before because that has been signed and you don't get to just kind of back off of that or something. Or the granting of a gift or a title by a monarch. We don't really have this in American society, but this does happen in monarchical systems where you have a monarch can grant. You can have a royal grant where there is something that is given or a title that is given or declared that then gives you certain rights that you didn't have before that. Or an election. Elections can grant certain rights. Then there is the acquiring of rights through given processes. And these are things that have nothing to do with human decision at all. And this really is primarily familial lineage. So there are certain rights that you have simply because of who your family is. And that's what everybody complains about today. That's privilege and all of this stuff. And there is, of course, privilege in your familial lineage, but this is also just how human society has functioned for its entire existence. That there are certain things that are given to certain people because of who their parents are. And they are inherited by birth. And this, of course, is clearest in a monarchy where, or any system that has any kind of aristocracy or nobility where, you have certain rights that are acquired simply because of who your parents are. They have been inherited. And the way that this still functions today, like in the United States, for example, is just inheritance. There are certain rights you have to the, say, wealth of your family because of who your parents are. And those who argue for like a total egalitarian society, as some do, want to get rid of inheritance altogether. They want to say that this is a completely unjust system and that you don't have any right to your family's money. As a father, I just think that's completely insane. Because if I work for a significant amount of money, I don't make much money doing this. Okay, so don't think that I have much. But whatever I do have, right? I work for it and I save things and I save purposefully so that my kids will have a good life. Who the heck wouldn't want that? And I don't want the government to come in and take that and say, I don't care that you have worked for the benefit of your kids. We're going to take this and disperse it equally to all people in society. That would be crazy. Though some people do want that. But there is this giving of rights that is there through familial lineage. There's plenty of stuff in Scripture about this, and that's just the order of things. I mean, this language of the will, that is things that are granted to the child. This is all mentioned, like in the book of Hebrews, even referencing the death of Christ as working in that same way. This is just part of how the world functions. Okay, here's a quick end here that is a rundown of differences between Stahl's approach and then what we find in what we generally refer to as classical liberalism, like we find in something like the French Revolution. For Stahl, rights are based in a transcendent order that is rooted in the divine law. For classical liberalism, rights are God-given by and large. They would say this, especially the deists will say this. They're God-given, but there is no clear shape of the divine order to be followed. Second, Stahl says rights take shape through positive law. So there are inherent rights, but the way that they work themselves out or are granted are through the particular legal order or system. Classical liberalism says positive law is often a hindrance to rights. They're competition. Third, individual rights, for Stahl, flow out of the higher principle of life relations. For classical liberalism, the primary unit of society and the foundation of law itself is the individual. Next point for Stahl, rights are not always granted through consent. For classical liberalism, true rights are given by contractual arrangement. For Stahl, rights flow out of man's created purpose to achieve spiritual perfection. And then for classical liberals, rights arise from man's natural condition considered in the state of nature. Stahl says rights entail duties, and then classical liberalism says rights do not necessarily create duties. Julius Stahl then finally says a person can violate his or her own rights. So rights are not just about autonomous freedom because I can violate my own rights. And then classical liberalism says rights are primarily in self-determination and free action. Well, that's all I have for you here on Friedrich Julius Stahl. He's a really interesting thinker. I know that not everybody's interested in political theory that watches my content, and that's fine. You don't have to be. But a lot of what I seek to do is to expose you to thinkers, especially in the Lutheran tradition, who have spoken about all sorts of things. Because Lutheran thinkers have spoken about far more areas of life and thoughts than just theology in the narrowest sense. So I think it's fun to spend some time in thinkers like this, and one who's very, very important for classical confessional Lutheranism, and one who's cited in a lot of theological texts as well as being pretty foundational to a Lutheran conception of the state. So I do have another one planned here. I've got enough content for another one of these on this slideshow. So we'll do that next time. And if you haven't make sure you subscribe here and on your podcast app. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.